Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week, and in some ways sort of the week before as well, because I didn't do a weekly reads then. So this is sort of a couple of weeks worth of books where I've sort of selected some ones that I really wanted to talk about that I really loved. So let's get talking about some of those. I'm just at the tail end of a cold, so again, please do excuse the sort of slightly, I wouldn't even say husky, but just sort of slightly like nasal and blocked up sound from this. Anyway, let's get talking about the books. So first up, I really wanted to talk about a book that is sort of special to me in several ways. And I'll sort of say as a full disclosure, I know the author and have sort of spent a lot of time with her because she is the sort of writer in residence at my local bookshop, and also I've done a creative writing course with her, and just I'm lucky enough to be able to hang out with her and chat with her. But anyway, enough preamble. Karen McLeod's Lifting Off. So she, basically, the long story short, Karen McLeod used to be a flight attendant, or cabin crew, or all of the other phrases or kind of terms that are used for it. She talks about that at one point in the book as well. And this is essentially a sort of memoir kind of that time, of those times when she was working in the air. But it kind of is much more than that. It talks about how that was also a kind of catalyst for her to kind of understand other parts about herself. So sort of without going into too much detail about what kind of else comes up in the book, her sort of reconciling a few things with herself about her sort of about alcohol and about how often she was using it. A few things in there as well about sort of following her dream of being a writer, and how does she sort of navigate that. It's just this whole sort of, this really beautifully done book, I think, of her talking about coming to terms with those things and sort of reckoning with them, but also the kind of the sheer weirdness of something like being a flight attendant or what have you. The kind of weird ways that it makes you appreciate or sort of work within time. So, you know, she talks about these long stretches of time of not really knowing what is going on outside in the world, and the fact that you're kind of in a cabin and you're sort of doing these things, and then you stop off, you sleep, you party, you sleep some more, you get back on a plane and do the whole thing in reverse. And there's this sort of odd reality to it. But I think what really elevates it for me as well is just that her little observations about things. She's very funny and very clever, but this book is also just full of heart and wisdom and joy. I think it's a really brilliant book. It's so beautifully done. And I kept on sort of checking in with myself as I was reading it of like, am I enjoying this because it's Karen and because I know her, or am I just enjoying this book? And it is the latter. I think this book is phenomenal. It's so well done. It's just really beautiful the way it looks at the ways that we're told to sort of follow our dreams, and this sort of this glamour that's associated with something like being a flight attendant. And yet the kind of sort of what lurks underneath it can be a sort of disconnect from other parts of your life or other parts of the world. So I thought this was really beautifully done. Yeah, I really highly recommend this. And Muswell Press are also republishing her first novel, The Case of the Missing Eyelash, if I've got that name, In Search of the Missing Eyelash, sorry. So that's also coming out as a republish through them as well, which I highly recommend. I read it a few years ago and really enjoyed it. Next up, and keeping it with small presses, I read Sean Northey's This House, translated by Susan Walton, and published by the lovely 3 Times Rebel Press. And this book I thought was really beautiful in so many ways. It's also really interesting for me to read a book translated from Welsh, because I think it's actually the first time, apart from little bits of the Mabinogion or kind of from Welsh folklore or what have you, that I've read a book that has been translated from Welsh. And it's interesting because, you know, it's a translated book and I'm used to that having sort of some degree of otherness, I guess, of, you know, being set in a different place and being somewhere that I don't necessarily, you know, there's a new experience for me. And actually it's quite weird to have that be in translation, but it be very much down the road, you know, just over in Wales. So that was really interesting as well, personally, for me. But this book, the core idea, we have a woman called Anna who has been living alone in this house for quite a while, and she's sort of become quite used to being quite isolated and being quite alone. And she's dealing with quite a few things, including some loss and really sort of trying to process bits of what's going on around her. But this unexpected guest, a man called Sean, comes over and this sort of shakes up her little world, and it kind of leads to these other bits of her mining through her old memories and really thinking about various things that have happened to her in her life. And what I think is so gorgeous about this is an incredibly spare and quiet book. And I know calling books quiet can seem more like an insult, but there's something about the way that she leaves breath in between moments that just allows things to settle in this really gorgeous, beautiful way. I found it really quite haunting, the ways that the scene would slowly shift to something else, and we hadn't quite finished with a point. There's something lingering between sentences and between paragraphs, and particularly in this case, a lot of what's lingering is her memories of this loved one that she's lost. I don't want to spoil who, but it kind of leads to these really poignant moments throughout the book where she's just sort of reflecting on these things and trying to work out what it might look like to rebuild a life, to sort of create herself anew. And it's full of these little moments of sort of quietness or politeness or sort of ritual. So even, for example, you sort of, sometimes you're watching characters have a conversation with each other while they're making some tea, and there's something about, I realise that's such a UK stereotype, but there's something about the ways that this happened, there's sort of the quiet rituals in the background of this. You know, somebody goes and does this thing, and then they get the milk, and then they, you know, these little things that sort of ticker away in the background, but behind each of them are people not really able to say what they're thinking, and so they're sort of just doing the ritual and kind of hoping that they build the courage to do the thing that you need to. I think there's something really special about this book. It's really profound and really quiet and haunting, but also there are just these little moments of levity and beauty that I just think is so well observed, and particularly just the ways that it looks at how we try and grieve and process loss and process change, I think is just really marvellous and a really beautiful, beautiful book. Next up, I read The Rachel Incident by Caroline O'Donoghue. And this book was just such a delight for me. I have to admit, I didn't really know much about it, and a friend of mine recommended it to me. And just said, you've got to read this. Even if you don't think this is going to be your thing, read it. And I loved it. I thought this was a really fun and interesting book. So essentially, I say fun, given a lot of the plot, you might not think so. But the core idea really is that we've got Rachel, who is a young student in Ireland, and she is working through various things. She's just kind of going to classes, sort of sorting bits, you know, all relatively normal. But then we start to kind of get the sense that she has these sort of interesting relationships with people around her. Like she talks quite early on into the book about how anytime she's in an enclosed space with a man, regardless of, you know, if it's a very old man or like a sort of man in their 20s, she has this sort of strong desire to feel that there's an intensity where they will have to have sex, or whether that's on the cards in some ways. And in some ways she kind of carries the same sort of black and white, slightly intense thinking to so many other parts of her life. But all of this kind of coalesces, I guess, around a professor. And she becomes close with this professor, partly in a sort of sense of her feeling like she needs to, there's something about him where she's sort of drawn to him. She might not necessarily feel like she actually wants to have sex with him, but there's a kind of intensity of this relationship. And what sort of spawns from that is a sort of this more kind of complicated web of being involved with this man's life. So again, without spoiling parts, there are sort of romantic elements, not for her, but sort of romantic elements that happen. She herself becomes more and more embedded in the life of this professor and his wife. In the backdrop of this, she also has her own boyfriend, sort of on-off. boyfriend and is trying to work out who she is. She's sort of very much full of that kind of lack of certainty about so many things in her life, and she's trying to just hold it together. But this book kind of particularly focuses then towards a point later on in the book where things really come to a head, where this kind of entrapment of being so close to people, and she references quite a lot of times in the book the sort of small town island kind of effect, where, you know, you can be in a bigger city. I think Cork is where most of this book happens. And, you know, even when you think that you're safe and that nobody knows your secrets, suddenly everybody knows everyone's secrets. And so there's this sort of suffocation that comes from it, which I think the book does really, really well. And so I just found this a really engaging, fun book of just following this woman's life as she tries to navigate, you know, what it means to be in a sort of society or kind of small town where everyone knows everyone's secrets, mostly, but also to be a young woman in that, where the sort of doubly so that affects you, because certain things can be assumed about you, particularly, you know, for young women, being assumed that if they've had sex or if they're seeing someone, that they're a certain kind of way or whatever. And so this book really taps into that and looks into that as well, but also through this really engaging, fun story. And again, I say fun. It's fun in the presentation, but often what's going on is quite dark. So I thought this was a really gripping, very well conceived and very well crafted in terms of the voice, kind of book as well. And last but not least, two books by Sathnam Sanghera. One is, well, both are non-fiction, but one is a memoir and one is sort of more of a sort of essay style non-fiction book. And let's start with his memoir, The Boy with the Top Knot. And this is essentially his story. Basically, I think this book does a real sort of bait and switch almost in a really great way. So I think right at the beginning of this book, you assume it's going to be a certain thing, or at least I did, in that it very much presents itself as a book that is talking about growing up young and Sikh in the UK, and particularly in this case in Wolverhampton. And so I think I was kind of expecting a fairly standard, typical book about the Sikh experience, and that's not to diminish those sorts of memoirs, but that's kind of, I suppose, more what I was expecting, about kind of balancing two cultures and kind of, you know, how you find yourself within that. But I think what this book does that's so interesting is then its depictions of so much else. So he starts to really delve into mental health and mental illness, and particularly focusing around schizophrenia. So he sort of finds out through the course of the book that his father and his sister both experienced schizophrenia, and he sort of is trying to understand it. We sort of get moments of him as a young boy, sort of very much seeing his parents' relationship as this very odd, very at times dysfunctional thing, and actually the sort of the schizophrenia diagnosis makes a lot more sense for him later, of being able to look back over some things that didn't quite make sense at the time. So there's that. But then also I think this book does some really clever things as well about then weaving in sort of some of those aspects all together. So this idea of sort of if there's mental illness in the family, and shame, and how sort of shame on a sort of cultural level and a kind of societal level works. So, you know, family members don't talk about this, and if they do talk about it and or understand it, then it's still kind of hidden over here somewhere. And, you know, things are expressed like that marriage can be the solution to something like schizophrenia or whatever. And so we see how those things play out. In the meantime, Sathnam is also looking at his dating history, and he's sort of wanting to date. And this book, essentially, the book that we read, has essentially become a way of him charting his family's history, but also being a way that he can talk to his parents about what he's experienced. And there's something really beautiful towards the end of this book about where this book sort of becomes a letter to his mother, that I just think is really beautifully done. It's such a heartfelt and bold and vulnerable and open book, and I think it's so cleverly done. And in some ways, the book I read before this, Empireland, also by Sanghera, refers to his memoir. So the memoir came first. And he refers to his sort of Sikh identity quite a lot during Empireland, particularly to talk about sort of historical ways in which the Sikh population have been sort of accepted or not in the wider UK population. So Empireland is more of a non-fiction essay sort of style book that really argues that so much of the UK's history is not only informed and shaped by empire in the sense of it is a huge part of, you know, several hundred years of UK history, but also it still very much shows up in a lot of day-to-day things now. So, you know, some of the last countries to leave the empire were sort of in the 60s, 70s. So that's actually not that far in terms of memory. There are many people alive in the UK who would have been alive and in the UK during that time, you know, in a sort of time pre sort of fall of empire for many countries, sort of pre-independence. But what's so interesting, I think, is just the way this book then explores that on a wider level. So the book takes this core idea and really explores it. So what does it look like in terms of the British psyche for international development when we think about empire and we think of it through that lens? You know, does it change things that the UK has, you know, previously colonized many, many countries in the world, and then now in terms of international aid, particularly if it's aid for a country that was formerly part of the empire, what does that mean? How does that look? And I think this book really cleverly breaks down some of those things. It's never preachy, I think. It's never a sort of judgy book, but it is very much exploring, well, actually, if we are to look at things like reparations, the numbers are so astronomical that it would be like this. So what does it actually look like feasibly if the UK were to try and cede its power that it's gained through empire? What does it mean to really redress that balance? So I think this book is really, really well done. I'm really excited for Empireland, which has not long come out, so Empire World, I think it's called, which looks at the wider world and its the effects that still linger from empire. So I'm really excited for that, and part of reading Empireland was sort of a preparation for that as well. But yeah, really exciting to finally get around to reading this book, and also his memoir, which is excellent. Yeah, really, really engaging books, really cleverly done and very, very thought through. So those are most of the books I think I want to talk about for this week. I read a few other really solid books, but it's one of those things where these are the ones that really were burning for me to sort of talk about. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker, talking about these books that I've read this week. Take care, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.